European history holds stories and secrets that are as fascinating as they are unexpected. Tonight, we will wander among the echoes of that rebirth, exploring moments that sometimes feel almost unreal. Before you settle in, take a moment to make yourself comfortable. And if you enjoy these late-night history wanderings, consider subscribing. If you'd like, leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. It's always fascinating to see who's tuning in from different corners of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe put on a small fan, just for that steady hum in the background. Settle into the quiet. Now let's begin. What if I told you that there was once an age when Europe awoke from centuries of shadow and stepped into light? An age when art, science, and ideas bloomed with such force that the world would never be the same again. This was the Renaissance. When we imagine the Renaissance, it is tempting to picture sunlight breaking suddenly over Europe, like dawn chasing away the dark of night. But history doesn't move in such clean strokes. The Renaissance was not a single spark. It was a long, slow shift, born out of centuries of hardship, crisis, and searching curiosity. To understand the glow of that new age, we have to first wander through the dim corridors of the late Middle Ages, a time when the old world was still crumbling, even as something new waited quietly to emerge. By the middle of the 14th century, Europe was weary. For generations, it had carried the weight of famine, war, and disease. The Black Death alone, that haunting plague of the 1340s, had swept across towns and villages with a swiftness that terrified even the most faithful. Whole communities vanished, leaving empty houses and silent streets. Some places never truly recovered, their fields abandoned, their churches left without parishioners. For those who survived, life took on a strange, uncertain quality. Death was everywhere, and yet, in that same shadow, people began to look at life differently. It was not only plague that unsettled the old order. Harvests failed more often than they succeeded. Winters were colder, rains heavier, and food less reliable. Families who had once lived securely found themselves scraping by, trading what little they had. For peasants bound to the land, there was hardship, but also the faint beginning of change. With so many gone, labor grew scarce, and the survivors could sometimes bargain for better wages or even move in search of new work. The rigid structures of feudal life, lords above, peasants below, began to loosen, if only slightly. Meanwhile, Europe's great powers seemed constantly at war. The 100 Years' War dragged on between England and France, draining treasuries and staining fields red. Castles burned, villages were raided, and whole regions became battlegrounds. And yet war, too, reshaped society. It encouraged new kinds of organization, new ways of raising money, and the slow professionalization of armies. Old feudal loyalties weakened, replaced by emerging forms of state power. The cracks in medieval society widened, making space for something else to take root. But perhaps the greatest change of all was not in battles or plagues, but in the human mind. In monasteries and universities, in marketplaces and merchant halls, people were beginning to ask questions. Old answers no longer seemed sufficient. How should one live when life was so fragile? Could there be more to existence than repeating the roles passed down for generations? The world felt unstable, but within that instability was room for new thought. Italy, in particular, found itself at the center of this shift. Unlike the kingdoms of northern Europe, Italy was divided into city-states: Florence, Venice, Milan, Genoa, and others, each fiercely independent, each competing for influence. They did not think of themselves as a single nation. Instead, they were rivals, bound together by trade and ambition. Florence prided itself on its banks and its guilds. Venice ruled the seas with its vast merchant fleet. Milan thrived on industry and military strength. This rivalry created tension but also opportunity. To outshine a neighbor, a city had to invest in architecture, in learning, in art. Competition became a fuel for culture. Geography, too, favored Italy. It lay nestled among the remnants of Rome, where broken columns still stood in overgrown fields and crumbling amphitheaters dotted city centers. For Italians, the past was not buried in books. It was literally under their feet. Every excavation might unearth a fragment of a statue, a piece of mosaic, a forgotten text. These ruins whispered of greatness, of an age when human skill and imagination had seemed limitless. To walk among them was to feel a kind of longing, a curiosity to rediscover what had been lost. Italy also sat at the crossroads of the Mediterranean. Trade routes from the east brought silk, spices and stories from distant lands. Venetian merchants sailed as far as Constantinople and beyond, returning not only with goods, but with ideas. Greek manuscripts preserved in the libraries of Byzantium and the Islamic world trickled into Italian hands. Knowledge thought long vanished. Philosophy, science, medicine found its way westward. These texts would prove to be kindling for the fire that was about to catch. Another force shaping the Italian world was money and those who controlled it. Banking families like the Medici of Florence, the Gonzaga of Mantua, and others grew rich through trade, finance, and careful political maneuvering. Their fortunes gave them power, but also a way to shape culture. Patronage, the support of artists, architects, and thinkers became both a duty and a form of prestige. To fund a cathedral dome, to commission a fresco, to hire a poet, was to leave one's mark on the city. Wealth was no longer only measured in gold, it was measured in the beauty and brilliance one could sponsor. For the ordinary people of these cities, life was still fragile. Plague returned in waves, streets were narrow and crowded, disease was always near, and political unrest could flare at any time. But there was also a sense of possibility. Guilds organized skilled workers, weavers, metal workers, painters, into powerful associations that protected their members and raised the status of their crafts. Even a shoemaker or a mason could take pride in his work, seeing it not only as labor, but as contribution to the fabric of the city. Religion remained central, of course. Cathedrals dominated skylines, bells marked the hours of the day, and festivals filled the calendar. Yet here, too, change was stirring. Devotion was still strong, but a more personal form of piety was spreading, one that focused not only on the authority of the church, but on the individual's relationship to faith. In art, saints were painted with more human features, less distant, more relatable. In sermons, preachers spoke of personal virtue, not just obedience. Slowly, the door opened for a shift in how people thought of themselves, not only as members of Christendom, but as individuals. As the 14th century gave way to the 15th, the old world had not disappeared. Castles still loomed on hilltops, pilgrims still travelled long roads to holy shrines, knights still fought, and monks still copied texts in scriptoria. But beneath these familiar shapes, something new was stirring. The cracks in the medieval order let in light, and the restless minds of Europe began to wonder what else was possible. If we look closely at this time, we see a paradox: devastation and renewal side by side. The same plague that emptied villages also freed people to move and reshape their lives. The same wars that destroyed land also broke the chains of feudalism. The same fear of death that haunted Europe also inspired a hunger to leave behind works of beauty that might outlast mortality. It was not a clean break, but a slow, uneven transformation. By the end of the Middle Ages, Italy had become a land of contrasts. Florence bustled with merchants and bankers. Venice glittered with wealth from the sea. Milan stood fortified and proud. Across the peninsula, towns and cities hummed with commerce, argument, rivalry, and ambition. The air seemed charged, as if waiting for a storm or a sunrise, and so, out of the fading shadows of the Middle Ages, the Renaissance began to stir. It would not announce itself with trumpets or fanfare. Instead, it crept quietly at first, in a scholar poring over an old Greek text, in an architect daring to imagine a dome unlike any before, in a painter experimenting with perspective. These small, scattered moments would gather force until they reshaped Europe and, eventually, the world. The Middle Ages were not only an ending, they were a threshold. And standing upon that threshold, Europe prepared to step into a new dawn. If the Renaissance was a fire, Florence was its first great flame. Other Italian cities had wealth, trade, and ambition, but Florence had something more, an energy that seemed to vibrate in its very stones. Surrounded by the hills of Tuscany, set along the banks of the Arno River, Florence was not large by the standards of empires. Yet in the 15th century, it became the stage upon which some of the most extraordinary transformations in human history unfolded. Florence was a republic, at least in name. Its government was shaped by councils and elected officials, but in practice, power shifted with wealth. The city's prosperity came from banking, trade, and a complex web of guilds, associations that organized artisans, merchants, and craftsmen into powerful networks. These guilds determined not only who could practice a trade, but also how the city invested in its own beauty. A baker or weaver might never meet the city's great bankers, but both were part of the same intricate organism. Florence lived, breathed, and thrived through the activity of its citizens. At the heart of this world stood the Medici. They were not rulers in the conventional sense, at least not at first. They were bankers, shrewd, disciplined, and ambitious. The Medici Bank, founded in the late 14th century, quickly became one of the most powerful financial institutions in Europe. Through careful lending, strategic marriages, and political maneuvering, the family wove itself into the fabric of Florence. By the time Cosimo de' Medici rose to prominence in the early 15th century, the family's influence stretched far beyond counting houses. They were not kings, but they held the purse strings that kings, popes, and princes often needed. Cosimo was not a man who sought titles. He preferred to work quietly, pulling strings behind the scenes. But what made him remarkable was his understanding of wealth. Money, in his eyes, was not merely to be hoarded, it was to be spent strategically on the cultivation of greatness. He became one of history's greatest patrons, funding architecture, supporting libraries, and commissioning works of art that would shape Florence for generations. His investments were not simply for prestige, they were a statement. Florence was to be more than a city of bankers, it would be a city of ideas. Patronage in Florence was a kind of language. To commission a painting, a statue, or a church was not only an act of devotion, it was also a declaration of civic pride, a reminder of family power, and a legacy that could outlast death. Wealth flowed into stone and paint, and in doing so, it transformed the city into an open-air gallery. Citizens walking the narrow streets could look up at soaring churches, gaze at frescoes in chapels, or pass by public statues that seemed almost alive. Beauty was not hidden behind palace doors, it was woven into the public life of Florence. One of the earliest and most dazzling examples of this was Filippo Brunelleschi's dome. For over a century, Florence's cathedral, Santa Maria del Fiore, had stood incomplete. Its massive central space yawned open because no builder had found a way to span it without the dome collapsing under its own weight. The problem seemed impossible, and yet in 1419, Brunelleschi, a goldsmith by training, not a master mason, presented a daring plan. His design defied tradition, using an ingenious double-shell structure and herringbone brickwork. to distribute weight. For years, Florentines watched as the Great Dome slowly rose above their city. When it was completed, it was not only a triumph of engineering, but a symbol of Florence itself, a city that dared the impossible and succeeded. While Brunelleschi was reshaping architecture, Donatello was redefining sculpture. His works abandoned the stiffness of medieval forms and breathed new life into stone and bronze. His famous bronze David, the first freestanding nude statue created since antiquity, shocked and fascinated Florence. Here was a biblical hero, but also a celebration of the human body, poised and alive. Donatello's figures seemed to move, to think, even to feel. They were no longer symbols. They were people, caught in moments of triumph, sorrow, or contemplation. His art reflected the essence of the Renaissance, the rediscovery of humanity itself. The energy of Florence extended beyond its artists. Its scholars were equally restless. Humanism, that new way of studying the world through the lens of classical antiquity, found fertile ground in the city's libraries and lecture halls. Cosimo de' Medici himself funded the collection of ancient manuscripts, including works of Plato that had been lost to the Latin West for centuries. He established the Platonic Academy in Florence, where thinkers like Marsilio Ficino gathered to discuss philosophy, religion, and the nature of the soul. These conversations did not remain abstract. They seeped into the way people thought about art, politics, and even daily life. The guilds played their part as well. Each trade had its own patron saint, its own chapel, and its own pride. The wool guild, the silk guild, the goldsmiths, the stonecutters. Together they created a culture in which craftsmanship was elevated to an art form. To weave a fine cloth, to carve a delicate relief, to paint a luminous panel, all were seen as worthy contributions to the city's glory. The guilds funded public works, sponsored competitions, and ensured that the arts were not merely the pastime of the wealthy, but the shared inheritance of the community. Florence's streets, though narrow and crowded, pulsed with this spirit. Markets bustled with goods from across Europe and the Mediterranean. Workshops glowed with the light of forges and the smell of pigments. Students debated in taverns, priests preached in cathedrals, merchants tallied accounts, while artists sketched in margins. It was a city alive in every sense, where the old medieval rhythms gave way to something altogether more dynamic. The Medici continued to shape this energy. Lorenzo de' Medici, known as Lorenzo the Magnificent, carried the family's patronage to even greater heights in the latter half of the century. Poets, philosophers, painters, and sculptors gathered in his circle, encouraged by his generosity and protected by his influence. It was in Lorenzo's Florence that a young Michelangelo first learned his craft, nurtured by a household that seemed to attract genius as naturally as the Arno attracted sunlight. Yet, Florence's greatness was not only in its leaders or its geniuses, it was in the collective belief that beauty and knowledge mattered, even in times of conflict, and Florence had many, including bitter rivalries with neighboring states and political unrest within its own walls. The city returned again and again to the pursuit of art and learning. Each crisis seemed to make its citizens more determined to prove their city's worth, not with armies, but with domes, paintings, and ideas. By the end of the 15th century, Florence was no longer simply another Italian city-state. It had become the symbol of a movement that would soon ripple across Europe. Visitors came to see the marvels of its churches, the elegance of its palaces, the brilliance of its artists. Scholars carried its manuscripts beyond the Alps. Merchants carried its ideas along with their goods. The light of Florence spread, flickering outward, catching fire in other places. But in this chapter of history, Florence remained the heart, a beating, restless heart, filled with ambition, pride, and vision. Its bankers counted coins, its guilds trained apprentices, its artists chipped away at marble, and its philosophers dreamed of worlds unseen. Out of these narrow streets and crowded workshops rose a dawn that would remake the world. Florence, in its golden century, was not merely a city, it was a crucible. And in its heat, the Renaissance took shape. If Florence gave the Renaissance its stage, and patrons gave it the means, it was the scholars who gave it a soul. Behind the arches of new buildings and the marble figures standing in courtyards, there was a quieter revolution unfolding, one written in ink, whispered in classrooms, and debated in letters carried across Europe. This revolution was called humanism, and it reshaped not only how people thought, but how they understood what it meant to be human. For centuries, much of European learning had been dominated by scholasticism, a method that prized the careful, logical study of theology built upon layers of commentary and debate. It was rigorous, disciplined, and deeply rooted in the authority of the Church. But by the 14th century, some thinkers began to turn their gaze elsewhere. They asked, what if wisdom could also be found in the voices of the ancients? What if the writings of Greece and Rome, poets, historians, philosophers, still had truths worth hearing? The man often called the father of humanism was Francesco Petrarca, or Petrarch. Born in 1304, he lived during a time when the plague haunted Europe and politics were unstable. Yet in the midst of this, Petrarch discovered solace in old manuscripts. He scoured monastic libraries for forgotten texts, finding works of Cicero, Livy, and others that had lain gathering dust for centuries. To Petrarch, these voices from the past were not relics. They were living companions. He wrote letters to them as though they were friends, conversing across the gulf of time. Petrarch's passion was not simply about collecting, it was about perspective. He believed that by studying the classics, one could cultivate virtue, eloquence, and wisdom. His poetry, written in Italian rather than Latin, celebrated personal feeling and the inner life. Where medieval writers often focused on the divine, Petrarch turned inward, exploring the heart, memory, and longing. This focus on the individual, on human experience, was radical. It did not deny God, but it shifted the center of thought closer to humanity itself. From Petrarch's example grew a movement. Scholars across Italy and beyond began to dedicate themselves to what they called the Studia Humanitatis and the studies of humanity. This included grammar, rhetoric, poetry, history, and moral philosophy. These were not merely academic exercises, they were seen as the foundation of a life well lived. To read Virgil was to learn not only language but moral character. To study history was to understand the choices and mistakes of those who came before. Education became less about fitting into a rigid structure of theology and more about shaping the whole person. The humanists were not isolated dreamers. They were teachers, secretaries, advisors, and diplomats. They brought their learning into the practical world of politics and civic life. A well-trained humanist could compose elegant speeches, draft persuasive letters, and argue for policies with grace. Rulers and city councils sought them out, not only for their knowledge but for their ability to make ideas move people. The power of humanism was not only in what was studied, but in how it was used. One striking example of this was Leonardo Bruni, a Florentine scholar who became the city's chancellor. Bruni embraced humanism as both philosophy and civic duty. He translated Greek works into Latin, including Aristotle's Politics, and he wrote histories of Florence that celebrated its republican spirit. To him, the past was not dead. It was a guide for the present, a mirror in which Florence could see both its triumphs and its failings. Through his pen, humanism became a tool of identity, helping Florentines understand themselves as heirs to Rome's civic greatness. But humanism did not remain confined to Italy. By the late 15th and early 16th centuries, it spread northward, carried by students, travellers, and the newly printed page. In the Low Countries, in England, in the German lands, it mingled with local traditions and took on new flavours. One of the most famous northern humanists was Desiderius Erasmus of Rotterdam. A priest and scholar, Erasmus combined classical learning with a sharp eye for the problems of his age. His writings were witty, biting, and often daring. In the praise of folly, he used humour to criticize corruption and superstition, yet he was not a revolutionary. Erasmus believed education and reason could reform society gently, guiding it toward wisdom without tearing it apart. Erasmus also devoted himself to editing and translating sacred texts, believing that access to accurate scripture was essential for true faith. Here we see the delicate balance of humanism. It celebrated human reason, but it also sought harmony with religion. Humanists did not reject Christianity. Many were devout believers. What they questioned was the narrowness of thought that confined all learning to theology. By opening the window to classical antiquity, they allowed fresh air to circulate in Europe's intellectual life. Education was transformed by this movement. Universities, once devoted mainly to law, medicine, and theology, began to broaden their curricula. Tutors encouraged their pupils to write in elegant Latin, to read Cicero for style, to imitate the clarity of ancient rhetoric. Libraries grew, filled with manuscripts and later printed books that multiplied rapidly after Gutenberg's press spread across the continent. A student in Florence might study Plato in the original Greek. A student in Paris might debate Seneca's moral lessons. Knowledge became a shared pursuit, stretching across borders. The humanist approach also influenced art and literature in subtle but profound ways. When painters turned their gaze toward the human body, they did so with an understanding of proportion drawn from classical sources. When poets wrote, they echoed the rhythms of Virgil and Ovid. When architects designed, they revived Roman arches, columns, and domes, seeing in them not only beauty but harmony, a reflection of the order of nature itself. Humanism created a framework that encouraged artists and thinkers to see the world as both sacred and profoundly human. Perhaps the most significant shift, however, was in how people thought about themselves. In medieval thought, the individual was often small, a fragment of a vast divine order. In humanist thought, the individual mattered. Each person had dignity, potential, and a role to play in shaping the world. This idea was not fully modern, but it planted seeds that would grow in centuries to come. The notion of human worth, of personal responsibility, and of individual creativity all found their roots here. Still, humanism was not without its critics. Some church leaders feared it encouraged vanity or pride. Some scholars argued it neglected the rigor of theology, and yet the tide could not be stopped. The hunger for knowledge, the joy of rediscovery, and the thrill of shaping ideas to fit the needs of the present proved too compelling. By the early 16th century, humanism had become one of the defining features of European culture. It was not a single doctrine, nor a rigid philosophy. It was, instead, a spirit, a way of approaching the world with curiosity, reverence for the past, and confidence in the potential of humanity. When we look back at this period, it is easy to be dazzled by the art and architecture that still stand. But behind those marvels was a quieter power, one that worked in classrooms, in libraries, and in the minds of men and women who believed words could change the world. Humanism was that power. It was the Renaissance not in stone or paint, but in thought itself. And from this foundation of ideas, the next chapters of the Renaissance would rise. When we imagine the Renaissance, the first images that often come to mind are paintings, bright colors, balanced scenes, and faces that seem to hold both soul and thought behind their eyes. But this new way of painting did not arrive all at once. It grew, slowly, as artists learned to stretch beyond the flat and symbolic world of the Middle Ages into something fuller, deeper, more human. To understand this shift, we can begin with Giotto di Bondone, working in the early 1300s, well before the Renaissance reached its height. Giotto's figures were different. They were not just icons on a wall staring solemnly outward. His saints and angels had weight, they cast shadows, they bent in sorrow or leaned in affection. In his frescoes for the Scrovegni Chapel in Padua, the Virgin Mary is shown not as a stiff symbol, but as a mother who cradles her child with tenderness. The mourners around Christ show real grief, faces twisted with sorrow. To later painters, Giotto seemed like the first to glimpse a new horizon. By the early 1400s, other artists began to carry that spark forward. Among them was Masaccio, a young painter from Florence whose career was tragically short, but whose influence was immense. Masaccio introduced something that had rarely been seen before, the careful use of linear perspective. In his fresco of the Holy Trinity in Santa Maria Novella, the viewer is drawn into a painted space that feels like an actual chapel, receding back into depth. For the first time, worshippers standing in the church could look at the wall and feel as though they were peering into another room. Perspective, at its heart, was a way of making sense of space. By using geometry, painters could set figures within an environment that obeyed the same rules the human eye follows. Floors stretched away at the right angles, arches curved properly, and people no longer floated without ground beneath them. The world of the painting began to mirror the world outside it. This was more than technique, it was a new way of seeing reality. But it wasn't only about lines and measurements. Renaissance painters sought to capture light itself. Instead of simple blocks of color, they layered paints to mimic how sunlight touched skin or how shadows softened along the folds of fabric. Look closely at Masaccio's fresco, The Tribute Money, in which Christ and his disciples stand in a Tuscan-like landscape. Their robes ripple with a weight that seems tangible. Their faces are carved by highlights and shade, and the figures belong naturally in the rolling hills behind them. While Masaccio brought geometry and naturalism, another Florentine painter gave the Renaissance its poetic voice. Sandro Botticelli was not concerned so much with mathematics as with beauty and symbolism. His famous Birth of Venus shows the goddess standing on a seashell, her body elongated, her hair flowing like golden waves. The scene does not obey strict perspective. The space is dreamlike, almost fragile, and yet the painting holds viewers in its spell because of its elegance, its rhythm, its sense of something both ancient and timeless. Botticelli drew upon myths that had lain dormant since antiquity, and in doing so he gave the Renaissance a connection not just to the present but to the deep well of classical imagination. These painters, though different in style, shared a common impulse to make painting more than decoration, more than flat illustration. They wanted it to be a window into truth of space, of story, of the human condition. Through their work, art began to tell stories not just of heaven but also of earth. Christ and his disciples looked like men who might have walked the streets of Florence. Angels smiled with faces that seemed to belong to neighbors or friends. Even mythological figures like Venus carried with them the suggestion of human feeling. The city of Florence nurtured these experiments. Workshops bustled with apprentices grinding pigments, stretching canvases, and watching carefully as masters laid brush to plaster. Patrons, guilds, merchants, and wealthy families commissioned altarpieces and frescoes not only for devotion, but also as a mark of civic pride. To have a chapel painted by Masaccio or Botticelli was to say that one's community stood at the forefront of culture and role. Painters belonged to the guild of doctors and apothecaries, since pigments were considered a kind of chemical craft. These organizations ensured steady commissions and encouraged standards of quality. But within this system, the most talented could rise to fame. Their names would be known, their works copied, their innovations discussed across Italy. As we drift deeper into the visual world of the Renaissance, it is important to pause and imagine how radical these changes seemed at the time. For centuries, art in Europe had followed traditions meant to emphasize the divine above the earthly. Figures were stylized, spaces were flat, symbolism was rigid. To suddenly see a chapel wall open into a three-dimensional space, or to encounter Venus rising from the sea as though the ancient myths had returned, must have been startling. It was as if the paintings themselves whispered, "The world is larger than you thought." The Renaissance painters were not abandoning faith, but they were expanding vision. Heaven and earth could both be shown on the same surface. Sacred stories could unfold in landscapes that looked like the Tuscan countryside. The human body could be celebrated not only as a vessel for the soul, but as a marvel of form and proportion. This blending of sacred and secular, of realism and imagination, gave Renaissance painting its enduring power. Giotto had begun the journey with figures that felt alive. Masaccio grounded them in space and light. Botticelli wrapped them in myth and poetry. Together they reshaped not just art, but how people thought about the act of seeing itself. From here, the path would continue toward even greater mastery. Painters like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo would take perspective, anatomy, and symbolism to new heights. But those later giants stood upon the foundations laid in Florence, where a handful of artists first dared to paint the world as they saw it, and, just as importantly, as they imagined it might be. The Renaissance, after all, was not only about rediscovering what had been lost, but also about inventing what had never been seen before. And in the strokes of these early masters, a new way of seeing was born. If the Renaissance could be distilled into a single person, a single restless mind that captured its spirit, it would be Leonardo da Vinci. He was not only a painter, though the few canvases he completed changed the course of art forever. He was not only an inventor, though his notebooks brimmed with sketches of machines that would not exist for centuries. He was not only a scientist, though he dissected bodies and charted the anatomy of muscles and bones with precision no one had seen before. Leonardo was, above all else, curious, endlessly, insatiably curious. His genius was not confined to one craft or one discipline. It overflowed, spilling into every corner of knowledge he could reach. Leonardo was born in 1452 in the small Tuscan town of Vinci, a child born outside of marriage to a local notary and a peasant woman. Perhaps because of this, he was never bound tightly to tradition or expectation. He grew up exploring the hills and streams around Vinci, observing how water flowed, how birds darted, how plants unfurled toward the sun. That habit of watching, carefully and with wonder, never left him. He would later write that nature itself was his teacher. As a teenager, Leonardo's father arranged for him to apprentice in Florence, in the workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio. Verrocchio's studio was a hive of activity, producing paintings, sculptures, and decorative works for Florence's patrons. Here, Leonardo learned the tools of the painter's trade, how to grind pigments, prepare panels, and handle the delicate brushwork required for portraits and altarpieces. His talent quickly became obvious. There's a story that when Leonardo painted an angel in Verrocchio's Baptism of Christ, his master looked at the figure, so graceful and natural compared to his own, and decided never to paint again. From the beginning, Leonardo's art carried a softness, a sense of life breathing just beneath the surface. He developed a technique later called sfumato, which means smoky. Rather than hard lines, he allowed shadows and light to blend seamlessly. Faces emerged from this haze as though touched by air, their expressions subtle and elusive. His paintings never looked flat. They looked alive, poised on the edge of thought. The most famous example, of course, is the Mona Lisa. Painted years later in Florence and carried with him until his death in France, it shows a woman with that mysterious half-smile, her eyes following the viewer with quiet intensity. The landscape behind her twists into winding rivers and distant mountains, reminding us that Leonardo's mind was never content with a portrait alone. It always reached outward into geology, geography, and beyond. Yet Leonardo's genius could never be contained by painting alone. His notebooks, thousands of pages filled with sketches and notes, reveal a mind that never stopped moving. He dissected corpses in the dead of night to understand how muscles flexed, how blood vessels branched, how the human heart pumped. His anatomical drawings are so accurate that modern doctors still admire their precision. In his delicate pen, strokes, bones, tendons, and organs come alive as if the body were a machine of divine complexity, waiting to be understood. But then, in another corner of the same notebook, you might find sketches of flying machines. He watched birds in the Tuscan sky and wondered how their wings lifted them. He imagined contraptions with flapping wings or great spirals like a screw that could twist into the air. He designed bridges, armored vehicles, even ideas for submarines. Few of these inventions were ever built in his lifetime, but they reveal the scale of his imagination. He lived centuries ahead of his own age, straining toward a future that would not exist until long after he was gone. Leonardo's restlessness also showed in his career. He worked for powerful patrons, the Medici in Florence, Ludovico Sforza in Milan, and eventually the King of France. But he was not always reliable. He accepted commissions for great altarpieces or murals and then left them unfinished as his attention drifted to new fascinations. His mural of the Last Supper in Milan is a masterpiece, capturing the moment when Christ tells his disciples that one of them will betray him. Each figure reacts with shock or denial, frozen in gestures that ripple across the table. Yet even here, Leonardo's experimental techniques caused the painting to decay quickly. Within decades, it was already fading, a fragile ghost of its original brilliance. This pattern, great vision, unfinished execution, haunted Leonardo throughout his life. He dreamed constantly, but rarely stayed long enough to complete what he began. Some have said he was trapped by his own genius, his curiosity leading him away just when others would have finished. And yet perhaps that incompleteness is part of his legacy. He left behind mysteries, fragments, glimpses of what might have been. Consider his sketches for a grand equestrian statue in Milan, meant to honor the Sforza dynasty. He studied horses tirelessly, capturing their muscles in mid-stride, their heads tossing with energy. He created a massive clay model, the largest of its kind. But wars came, bronze was scarce, and the statue was never cast. The clay model was destroyed, and all that remains are his drawings, visions of power and grace that lived only on paper. Even his notebooks were written in mirror script, reversed, as though meant to be read only in reflection. Was it secrecy, habit, or simply another quirk of his mind? We still puzzle over these pages, filled with half-completed ideas, formulas, and diagram. Leonardo left behind more questions than answers, but perhaps that too was his nature. He did not seek to conclude, he sought to explore. In his later years, Leonardo moved to France at the invitation of King Francis I, who admired him not just as an artist, but as a man of extraordinary intellect. There, in a quiet manner at Clou near Amboise, he continued to sketch, to plan, to think, though age had slowed his hand. He died in 1519, leaving behind fewer than 20 surviving paintings, thousands of sketches, and an aura of mystery that has never faded. What makes Leonardo unforgettable is not only what he achieved, but what he reached for. He blurred the boundaries between art and science, between imagination and observation. He painted faces that still feel alive centuries later, and he designed machines that anticipated helicopters and tanks. He walked through the world with eyes open wider than most of us can imagine, always looking, always questioning. In him, we see the Renaissance distilled, the hunger to rediscover ancient wisdom, the drive to push knowledge forward, the belief that human curiosity could unlock the secrets of nature itself. He was a man of his time, and yet utterly beyond it. As we drift away from his story tonight, picture Leonardo leaning over his desk by candlelight, a notebook open, his pen moving swiftly. Perhaps he is sketching the curve of a muscle, perhaps the flight of a bird, perhaps the faint smile of a woman he has seen in passing. The candle flickers, ink dries on the page, and already his thoughts have leapt to something else. That was Leonardo, restless, brilliant, forever chasing the horizon. If Leonardo da Vinci was the restless dreamer of the Renaissance, Michelangelo Buonarroti was its storm. Fierce, uncompromising, and driven almost beyond endurance, he carved his name into history, not with pen or brush alone, but with chisel and hammer, striking stone until it seemed to breathe. He saw in marble not cold weight, but trapped souls waiting for release. To him, sculpting was not a craft of adding form, but of freeing what already existed within. Michelangelo was born in 1475 in Caprese, a small town in Tuscany. Unlike Leonardo, whose early life was filled with wonder at nature, Michelangelo's youth was marked by discipline, strict training, and an intensity that never left him. He once said, "I am still learning, even in his old age," but beneath those words was a man who demanded perfection of himself and of others. His training began in Florence, in the workshop of Domenico Ghirlandaio, a painter. Yet Michelangelo's true passion revealed itself not on canvas but in stone. He spent hours sketching ancient statues, absorbing the power of classical forms. Lorenzo de' Medici, the great patron of Florence, recognized the boy's talent and invited him into his court, where Michelangelo studied antiquities and mingled with scholars and poets. Here, surrounded by fragments of Rome's past, he began to dream of sculpting works that would rival the ancients and surpass them. The first great triumph of his career was the Pietà, carved when he was barely in his 20s. Created for St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, it shows the Virgin Mary cradling the lifeless body of Christ after the crucifixion. The marble is polished to a softness that seems impossible. Folds of Mary's robes flow like silk, and Christ's muscles rest with the slackness of death. Yet the sorrow is serene, not violent. Mary's face is young, almost ageless, as if grief has purified rather than aged her. Visitors to the basilica often mistake the statue for something more than stone, something sacred, untouchable. From there, Michelangelo turned back to Florence for a commission that would test not only his skill, but his endurance. The colossal statue of David. A massive block of marble had sat abandoned for decades, flawed and unwieldy. Other sculptors had attempted to work with it and failed. Michelangelo saw possibility where others saw ruin. For more than 2 years he worked in near solitude, chipping away until the figure emerged, towering, confident, alive. David stands not in the act of battle, but just before it, holding his sling casually over his shoulder, his gaze fixed with steady determination. The veins in his hands pulse with tension, the muscles of his body coiled with potential energy. He is not just a biblical hero, he is Florence itself, youthful, defiant, standing against larger foes. When the statue was unveiled in 1504, crowds gathered in awe. It was not simply a sculpture, it was a declaration of the human spirit. Michelangelo's reputation soared, and soon Pope Julius II summoned him to Rome. Their relationship was fiery. Julius was impatient, commanding, and Michelangelo was equally stubborn. At first, he was commissioned to design the Pope's tomb, a project that would haunt him for decades, always delayed, always reshaped. But Julius had another demand. He wanted Michelangelo to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Michelangelo resisted. He considered himself a sculptor, not a painter. Yet the Pope insisted, and so Michelangelo climbed the scaffolding in 1508 and began a task that would consume 4 years of his life. Working largely alone, lying on his back, he painted a vast cycle of biblical scenes across the curved ceiling, over 300 figures in total. The centerpiece, the creation of Adam, shows God reaching out to spark life into Adam's hand. The space between their fingers has become one of the most famous images in art, a symbol of divine touch and human potential. But the surrounding scenes are equally powerful. Prophets, sibyls, and ancestors of Christ all crowd the space, their bodies twisting with muscular energy. Michelangelo's figures are never static. They strain, turn, stretch, as though the chapel itself cannot contain their force. The ceiling transformed painting as profoundly as David had transformed sculpture. Visitors craned their necks in astonishment. This was not decoration. It was a vision of humanity's relationship with the divine written on the very vault of the church. But Michelangelo's fiery nature made him enemies as well as admirers. He had rivalries with other artists, none more famous than with Leonardo da Vinci. The two men, working in Florence around the same time, were opposites in temperament. Leonardo, the elegant courtier and thinker, Michelangelo, the brooding, solitary craftsman. When the city commissioned both men to paint battle scenes on the walls of the town hall, it was meant to be a contest of genius. Neither finished their work, but the fragments and sketches left behind revealed the depth of their rivalry. Michelangelo's personality was as stormy as his art was sublime. He lived simply, often in near poverty despite his commissions. He quarreled with patrons, mistrusted others, and carried a deep sense of isolation. Yet out of this turbulence came works that seemed touched by eternity. His later years were marked by more struggles. The unfinished tomb of Julius II, known for its haunting Moses, and the grand fresco of the Last Judgment painted decades after the Sistine ceiling. In that vast wall of the chapel, Christ appears not as a gentle saviour, but as a stern judge, and the human figures are swept upward or downward in a storm of bodies, muscular, anguished, alive. What makes Michelangelo unforgettable is not just his technical mastery, but the intensity he infused into stone and paint. His figures strain as if they want to step out of the marble, to break free from their prison. His paintings are crowded with energy, each body a vessel of emotion and power. He captured both beauty and torment, serenity and struggle. And beyond his art, he was also a poet. Michelangelo wrote sonnets and verses that reveal a mind as restless as his chisel, grappling with love, faith, and mortality. His words, like his sculptures, often circle around the idea of being trapped in stone, yearning for release. He lived to the age of 88, an extraordinary span for his time, and worked until the end. In Rome, near the end of his life, he was still sketching architectural designs for St. Peter's Basilica, shaping the very heart of the Vatican. When he died in 1564, his body was returned to Florence, where he was buried with honors befitting the man they called Il Divino, the Divine One. Michelangelo's legacy is not only the works he left behind, but the sense of awe they continue to inspire. Stand before the Pietà and you feel the tenderness of grief carved into marble. Look up at the Sistine ceiling and you feel the weight of creation pressing down. Stand before David and you feel courage surge as if the statue itself were alive. He was, in every sense, the poet of stone, one who believed that within every block of marble was a soul waiting to be freed, and with hammer and chisel he gave those souls voice. By the early 16th century, the center of the Renaissance began to shift. Florence, with its bustling workshops and proud republic, had birthed the great experiments of painting, sculpture, and humanist thought. But Rome, eternal, ancient, and powerful, was ready to claim the role of cultural capital. The popes of this era, Julius II and Leo X above all, were determined not just to lead the church, but to reshape the very image of the papacy. Through patronage of art and architecture, they would make Rome shine with a brilliance not seen since the days of the Caesars. Julius II, who reigned from 1503 to 1513, was a man of ambition and iron will. Nicknamed the Warrior Pope, he led armies into battle and expanded papal territories. Yet his vision was not limited to politics or war. Julius believed that the power of the church should be embodied in its buildings and images. He wanted Rome to become a living testament to faith, grandeur, and authority. To achieve this, he summoned the greatest artists of his age. One of his most decisive acts was to order the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica, the central church of Christendom. The old basilica, dating back to Constantine, had fallen into disrepair. Julius wanted a structure that would dwarf anything before it, a temple worthy of both God and papal power. For this monumental task he turned to Donato Bramante, a master architect from Urbino. Bramante's vision was revolutionary. He planned St. Peter's as a grand Greek cross design, with a massive central dome that would soar into the heavens. Inspired by classical Roman architecture, he sought to harmonize vast space with perfect proportion. His designs promised a church that would not only dominate the skyline of Rome, but also embody the ideals of balance, clarity, and strength that defined the High Renaissance. Though Bramante would not live to see his plan completed, his foundations set the course for generations to come. While Bramante raised walls and laid out domes, another genius was at work inside the Vatican, Raphael. If Michelangelo was the fiery soul of the Renaissance, Raphael Sanzio was its harmony. Born in Urbino in 1483, Raphael came to Rome in his mid-20s and quickly became the darling of papal patronage. Julius II commissioned him to decorate the papal apartments known as the Stanze di Raffaello. In these rooms, Raphael created frescoes that embody grace, order, and a serene vision of human achievement. The most famous, the School of Athens, shows philosophers of the ancient world gathered beneath grand arches. Plato and Aristotle stride at the center, surrounded by figures like Socrates, Pythagoras, and Euclid, each captured in lively debate or quiet thought. At the far edge, Raphael even included a portrait of himself, as though to say that the thinkers of the Renaissance now stood among the ancients. The fresco is more than decoration. It is a declaration that knowledge, both sacred and secular, belongs within the house of the Church. Julius II's vision of papal power was not only spiritual, but intellectual and cultural, and Raphael gave that vision form. His figures move with elegance, their gestures calm and balanced. Even in crowded scenes, harmony prevails. To stand in the stanza is to feel the Renaissance at its most assured, confident that humanity could achieve beauty and truth through reason and art. Under Julius II, Rome became a workshop unlike any other. Michelangelo painted the Sistine Chapel ceiling at the Pope's command, Bramante laid out St. Peter's, and Raphael filled the papal apartments with visions of wisdom. The city itself became the stage on which the Renaissance reached its towering peak. After Julius's death, Leo X continued the patronage with equal zeal. Born Giovanni de' Medici, son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, Leo carried the Florentine tradition of supporting artists into the heart of Rome. He adored music, theatre, and spectacle, and his reign, turned the Vatican into a place of both solemn devotion and dazzling display. For Raphael, Leo's patronage opened new opportunities. He was named chief architect of St. Peter's after Bramante's death, and he designed chapels, palaces, and villas across Rome. His style was versatile. Whether painting tender Madonnas or grand historical scenes, Raphael captured the ideal of balance. To his contemporaries, he seemed almost effortless, as if beauty simply flowed from his hand. But the grandeur of Rome was not only about painters and architects. Sculptors, poets, musicians, all found a place in the city's vibrant cultural life. The papal court became a magnet for talent from across Italy and beyond. To walk through Rome in the early 16th century was to be surrounded by works in progress, scaffolding rising around new churches, frescoes unfolding across walls, and statues being carved that echoed the glories of Greece and Rome. What defined the high Renaissance in Rome was not just the brilliance of individuals, but the combination of vision and patronage. Julius II and Leo X used their wealth and authority to summon genius, and genius answered. The papacy, once seen primarily as a spiritual power, now projected itself as the cultural center of Europe. The Vatican was not only the seat of the Church, it was the beating heart of art and architecture. And yet, beneath the splendor, there were tensions. Building St. Peter's required enormous funds which the papacy sought through the sale of indulgences, a practice that would soon ignite fierce criticism and eventually the fire of the Reformation. The very grandeur of the Renaissance in Rome contained within it the seeds of crisis. But for a brief moment, those concerns seemed far away. What mattered was the brilliance of artists shaping visions that would outlast their patrons. By the time Raphael died in 1520, at only 37, Rome mourned him with extraordinary ceremony. His funeral was held in the Pantheon, the ancient temple to all gods that had become a Christian church. His tomb still lies there, beneath an inscription that calls him nature's rival. For in Raphael, the Renaissance reached a harmony so complete that it seemed as though the natural and the divine had been joined. Michelangelo would continue the story in Rome, taking up the challenge of St. Peter's Dome decades later, and his Last Judgment would darken the Sistine Chapel with apocalyptic force. But the balance of Bramante's geometry and Raphael's calm vision remain as the emblem of the High Renaissance, the moment when Rome, once fallen into ruin, again became the capital of the world. The High Renaissance was brief, lasting only a few decades, but its achievements shaped centuries. In its frescoes, domes, and marble, the ideals of proportion, harmony, and human potential were carried to their highest expression. And at the center of it all stood Rome, the eternal city, reborn as the stage on which art and faith embraced one another in splendor. While painters and sculptors shaped the visible world, another revolution was quietly unfolding in workshops across Europe, a revolution that would touch every mind, every home, and every corner of human thought. It was the invention of the printing press, a technology that seemed simple at first glance, yet would alter the course of history in ways few could have imagined. Before Gutenberg, books were rare treasures. Each volume was handwritten, often by monks laboring in scriptoriums for months or years. Illuminated initials glowed on pages, but their beauty was coupled with scarcity. A library might hold a few dozen volumes, and only the wealthiest or the most powerful could access them. Knowledge was contained, guarded, almost secret. To own a book was to hold a kind of magic, a piece of human thought captured and preserved against time. Then came Johannes Gutenberg, a German inventor from Mainz. Around the mid-15th century, he developed a system of movable type, using individual letters cast in metal that could be arranged, inked, and pressed onto paper. The genius of this innovation was in its reproducibility. Texts could be copied quickly, accurately, and in numbers previously unimaginable. A single press could produce hundreds of books where before one might have taken years. The first major work Gutenberg printed was the 42-line Bible, completed around 1455. Its pages are dense, yet perfectly uniform. The letters seem to rise from the paper, precise and deliberate. In design, it mirrored manuscripts in careful detail, so readers would feel familiar with its appearance. But the significance was not merely aesthetic. For the first time, ordinary scholars could access complete texts of sacred scripture without relying entirely on clergy or laborious hand copying. The printed book began to shift the relationship between knowledge and power. The spread of printing was quiet but relentless. Presses emerged in Italy, France, the Low Countries, and Spain. Cities with universities became hubs of printed learning, as scholars, students, and artisans could now share ideas more rapidly than ever before. The effect on literacy was profound. People who had once struggled to read manuscripts could now find books that were affordable, standardized, and widely distributed. Schools and universities began to flourish in new ways, with curricula expanding to include not just theology and law, but classical texts, scientific treatises, and poetry. Printing also transformed religion. Access to scripture in local languages, once nearly impossible, became feasible. Clergy could now read and interpret texts themselves, and lay people, in some regions, could study the Bible directly. This subtle shift planted the seeds for reformations to come, because knowledge was no longer centralized. Ideas could travel, be questioned, and debated in ways that had been almost impossible in earlier centuries. A quiet democratization was underway, one that would ripple through education, philosophy, and science. In science, the printing press accelerated discovery. Scholars could circulate treatises describing experiments, observations, and inventions. A medical student in Paris might read a text by an anatomist in Florence, replicating experiments with accuracy. Astronomical calculations, anatomical diagrams, and mathematical proofs could now be shared across borders, building a cumulative understanding that no single scriptorium could achieve. Scientific thought, once slow and local, became increasingly interconnected. Printing also created a new cultural consciousness. Authors could now reach audiences far beyond their immediate circles. Poetry, chronicles, and philosophical essays could inspire and challenge readers hundreds of miles away. Ideas moved faster than armies or merchants. Even in quiet homes, the press was shaping minds, turning reading into an activity that could be both private and revolutionary. Yet the revolution was subtle at first. It did not roar with cannon fire or march with armies. It crept quietly, one book at a time, until suddenly centuries of isolation had vanished. The humanist texts cherished in Florence, the philosophical debates in Rome, the scientific sketches in northern workshops, all could now exist simultaneously in many hands. Knowledge once confined began to flow like a river. In Italy, printing presses multiplied quickly. Venice became a center of production, with publishers producing thousands of volumes each year. Classical works of Cicero, Livy, and Plutarch were made available to a new generation of humanists. The combination of humanist scholarship and accessible text created a feedback loop. Scholars could study, comment, and distribute their ideas more efficiently, sparking further inquiry. The press also had a visual impact. Illustrations, once painstakingly copied by hand, could now be reproduced alongside text. Maps, diagrams, and woodcut images traveled along with words, enhancing the reader's understanding. The Renaissance, which had already reshaped painting, sculpture, and architecture, now found a new medium, one that could reach every study, every classroom, every library. Despite its benefits, the printing press also brought tension. Authorities feared the rapid spread of ideas. Censorship became a tool for controlling thought, and debates erupted over which texts should be allowed. Yet even suppression could not stop the flow. Books circulated in private collections, in university halls and in hidden corners of cities. Knowledge had become mobile, and once mobile, it could not be contained. In retrospect, the invention seems inevitable, yet in its time, it must have appeared miraculous. Gutenberg's press did not create ideas, but it amplified them. It allowed the Renaissance, already flourishing in art, architecture, and philosophy, to reach beyond its local origins in Florence and Rome. The seeds planted by humanists and artists could now be shared widely, creating a Europe more connected intellectually than ever before. One striking aspect of the press was its silence. Unlike the dramatic feats of painting a fresco ceiling or chiseling a statue from marble, the press worked quietly, methodically. Pages emerged from the press, stacked and ready, carrying words that would spark thought, debate, and sometimes even rebellion. The revolution was not in spectacle, but in the quiet acceleration of human curiosity. By the end of the 15th century, printed books could be found in courts, monasteries, and universities. Merchants traveling along trade routes might carry volumes with them. Students could afford copies of classical texts. Even the growing bourgeoisie could encounter literature that had been the province of elites. Literacy, once a rarity, began to spread, creating a population more engaged with ideas, more capable of reflection, and more curious about the world. In essence, Gutenberg's invention turned the abstract dreams of humanism into something tangible. The works of Petrarch, Erasmus, and other scholars could now move across borders with ease. Philosophers, artists, and scientists could stand on one another's shoulders, building understanding across time and space. And though the press itself made no noise beyond the press of metal against paper, its impact echoed through centuries, shaping not only the Renaissance but every era that followed. The quiet revolution of the printing press reminds us that sometimes change does not come with spectacle or fury. Sometimes it comes one page at a time, allowing thought to spread, to take root, and to blossom. By transforming the accessibility of knowledge, Gutenberg ensured that the Renaissance was not confined to Florence or Rome, nor to a single generation. Ideas could travel farther, faster, and reach deeper into the minds of humanity. And so, while Michelangelo's figures strained against marble and Raphael's philosophers debated on frescoed walls, the printing press whispered a different message: that knowledge belongs to no single hand, that learning is a river, and that the world itself could be remade by quiet curiosity, one letter, one page, one book at a time. As the 15th century drew to a close, the ideas and innovations of the Italian Renaissance began to cross the Alps, moving into regions that would eventually become Germany, Flanders, the Netherlands, and England. But while the Italian Renaissance celebrated harmony, proportion, and classical beauty, the Northern Renaissance found its voice in a cooler, more introspective register. Here, art carried not only clarity but mystery, not only elegance, but subtle unease. Light, texture, and minute detail became tools to explore both the material and the spiritual worlds. One of the first to make this shift visible was Jan van Eyck, active in Flanders in the early 1400s. He is often credited with perfecting oil painting, a medium that allowed colors to glow with unprecedented depth and realism. Van Eyck's work is meticulous. Each fold of fabric, each glint of metal, each reflection in a window pane is rendered with careful observation. Look at his Arnolfini portrait, and the room seems to contain more than two figures. The chandelier, the wooden floor, the small dog at their feet, and the convex mirror in the background reflect a world so precise it feels almost photographic. Yet this realism is paired with layers of symbolism. The mirror shows more than the couple. It reflects witnesses, divine presence, and perhaps the weight of social expectation. In the North, the natural world itself became a source of fascination. Artists studied how light touched leaves, how dew refracted across a petal, how wood grain caught the afternoon sun. Unlike the grand vistas of Italian landscapes, northern scenes often lingered in intimate interiors, quiet towns, or secluded gardens. Every object could carry meaning, and every shadow could suggest a hidden truth. There was an attention to observation that resembled the careful notes of a scientist as much as the brush of a painter. Parallel to this detailed realism, a very different strain of northern art emerged: the visionary, surreal worlds of Hieronymus Bosch. Active in the late 1400s and early 1500s in the Netherlands, Bosch filled panels with imagination both whimsical and terrifying. His garden of earthly delights is a labyrinth of forms. Nude figures frolic among oversized fruit, fantastical animals, and impossible machines. Every corner teems with allegory and moral warning. The work is unsettling not because it is violent, but because it is complex, dense, and strange. The viewer can wander endlessly through its details, discovering new puzzles each time. Bosch's imagination suggests that the spiritual and psychological realms can be as real and as chaotic as the physical world itself. Meanwhile, in Germany, Albrecht Dürer was creating a bridge between the Italian and northern traditions. Dürer traveled to Italy to study proportion, perspective, and classical forms, yet he never abandoned the meticulous attention to detail characteristic of northern art. His engravings, such as Melancholia I, are filled with symbols, mathematical instruments, and strange devices, each element carefully rendered. His woodcuts and prints spread his influence far beyond the cities where he worked, allowing ideas about proportion, anatomy, and humanist thought to circulate widely. In Dürer, the Northern Renaissance found both technical mastery and intellectual depth. The mood of the North was different from that of Italy. Whereas Florence and Rome were filled with sunny courtyards, monumental domes, and balanced compositions, the North often turned inward, exploring the inner life, morality, and the subtle interplay of light and shadow. Interiors glimmered with reflected light, faces hinted at thought and emotion beneath careful composure. Landscapes felt alive with the cycles of nature, sometimes serene, sometimes ominous. The human experience was layered, complex, and sometimes disturbing. The printing press, which we spoke of earlier, played a role here as well. Northern artists could study texts and illustrations in books, learning anatomy, proportion, and geometry alongside Italian masters. Dürer, for example, published treatises on human proportions and perspective, blending northern observational skill with Italian methods. This exchange helped the Renaissance to evolve differently in each region, producing a distinctive style that mirrored the culture and environment of Northern Europe. The Northern Renaissance also embraced religious subjects in a way that emphasized personal devotion. Altarpieces and devotional panels were often small enough to sit in a home rather than a cathedral, inviting private meditation. The focus was less on grand narratives and more on intimate reflection. A saint caught in thought, the Madonna holding Christ with tenderness, the light falling softly across a domestic interior. These works encouraged viewers to enter into contemplation, to see the sacred in everyday life. Flemish guilds played a crucial role in supporting this art. Cities like Bruges and Ghent were hubs of trade, wealth, and civic pride. Patrons, merchants, bankers, and civic institutions commissioned works for private devotion or public display. The Northern Renaissance flourished in these urban centers, blending economic vitality with an appetite for both realism and imaginative storytelling. Art in the North was not limited to painting and printmaking. Tapestries, metalwork, and illuminated manuscripts were also transformed by Renaissance sensibilities. The textures of woven wool or embroidered silk could be rendered with astonishing detail, combining technical skill with narrative imagination. Objects became miniature worlds, each detail deliberate, each surface imbued with meaning. Even in literature, the Northern Renaissance reflected these traits. Writers explored moral questions, human psychology, and social observation with a depth that complemented visual art. Erasmus, for example, combined classical learning with sharp observation of contemporary life, producing works that were witty, critical, and insightful. The printed word and visual imagery together created a culture that prized careful thought, close observation, and the interplay of reason and imagination. Yet, despite these achievements, the North retained a sense of mystery and tension. Unlike the measured balance of Raphael or Bramante, Northern art often suggested that the world was not entirely knowable. Shadows might hide secrets, reflections might hint at duality, landscapes could feel simultaneously familiar and alien. This blend of realism and enigma makes Northern Renaissance works endlessly compelling, inviting viewers to linger, to examine, and to wonder. As the Renaissance crossed the Alps, it adapted to its surroundings. The cold, often foggy climate, the denser forests, and the urban centers of the North influenced the palette, composition, and mood of artworks. Colors were often deeper, lighting more nuanced, and textures more tactile. Where Italy celebrated idealized forms bathed in golden sunlight, the North explored detail, subtlety, and the interplay of inner and outer worlds. In essence, the Northern Renaissance mirrored Italy's achievements in technique and humanism, but interpreted them through a different lens, a lens of reflection, observation, and moral contemplation. Artists like Van Eyck, Bosch, and Dürer expanded the possibilities of representation, exploring both the external world and the human psyche with equal intensity. Their works remind us that the Renaissance was not a single style or place, but a constellation of innovations, each region adding its own light and shadow. By the mid-16th century, the Northern Renaissance had firmly established itself, producing a legacy of art, print, and thought that would influence generations. Its attention to detail, its mystical and moral undertones, and its blending of observation with imagination created a culture that valued both precision and wonder. Here, across the mountains from Florence and Rome, the Renaissance had found a new voice, one cooler, darker, and yet no less brilliant. And as we pause in this chapter of mirrors and shadows, we see that the Renaissance is no longer confined to a single city, a single medium, or a single mood. It has become a Europe-wide phenomenon, one that adapts, transforms, and continues to challenge the way we see the world. The Alps, once a barrier, are now a conduit, carrying the ideas of humanism, observation, and artistic experimentation into lands that will carry the Renaissance into new forms, new visions, and new centuries. As the Renaissance matured, it became clear that the human thirst for understanding was no longer satisfied by art and philosophy alone. Artists and thinkers had reawakened an interest in the human form, in perspective, and in the classical past, but a new kind of curiosity was stirring, one directed toward the natural world itself. Observation, measurement, and questioning began to challenge long-held beliefs, slowly shaking the heavens and peering into the hidden mechanisms of life. It began with the stars. For centuries, the Ptolemaic model, Earth at the center of the universe, with the sun, planets, and stars orbiting in perfect spheres, had dominated European thought. This geocentric view, inherited from antiquity and sanctioned by church authority, seemed both obvious and sacred. Yet by the early 1500s, whispers of a different understanding began to emerge. Nicholas Copernicus, a Polish canon and astronomer, observed the heavens with patience and careful calculation. He proposed a bold idea that the sun, not the Earth, was the center of the universe, and that the planets, including Earth, revolved around it. Copernicus's model, the heliocentric theory, did not merely rearrange celestial bodies. It challenged the very way humans perceived themselves in relation to the cosmos. If Earth was not the center, then the universe was far larger, more complex, and less anthropocentric than previously imagined. Copernicus published his work De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium in 1543, just before his death. Initially, it was received with cautious interest. Scholars debated its implications while the Church regarded it with suspicion. The heliocentric model demanded a new way of thinking, one in which observation and mathematics began to take precedence over received authority. It planted a seed that would grow over decades, influencing thinkers, astronomers, and even philosophers across Europe. While the heavens were being reconsidered, the human body itself became a subject of scrutiny. For centuries, anatomy had been studied largely through texts, often copied from ancient authorities such as Galen. Knowledge of the body was based on theory, not direct observation. Then came Andreas Vesalius, a Flemish physician who dared to look closer. Vesalius performed dissections himself, carefully observing the structure of muscles, bones, and organs. His groundbreaking work, De Humani Corporis Fabrica, published in 1543, offered detailed illustrations that corrected centuries of error. Vesalius showed that the heart, the brain, the vascular system, all the mechanisms of life, could be understood through careful study, not simply repeated from old texts. For the first time, physicians and students could see the body as it truly was, a machine of intricate design, beautifully complex and vulnerable. The Renaissance fascination with discovery extended even further into the realms of motion and mechanics. The laws of nature, once largely unexplored beyond philosophy, began to yield their secrets to observation and experiment. Galileo Galilei, born in Pisa in 1564, exemplified this spirit. Trained in mathematics and natural philosophy, he was captivated by the stars and by terrestrial motion alike. Galileo improved the telescope, turning it toward the heavens. He observed moons orbiting Jupiter, the phases of Venus, and the rugged surface of the moon, evidence that the cosmos was far more varied and dynamic than classical teachings suggested. Galileo's work was revolutionary not only for what he saw, but for how he approached knowledge. He emphasized measurement, repeatability, and evidence, principles that would become the foundation of modern science. But his discoveries also brought him into conflict with established authority. The heliocentric model he defended was still controversial, and the Church viewed his claims as a challenge to Scripture. Galileo faced trial, censorship, and house arrest, yet he continued to write, leaving a legacy that would endure long after his death. The developments in astronomy and anatomy illustrate a larger shift in Renaissance thought, the growing tension between faith and reason. Scholars and artists had already begun to question classical and religious authority in their fields, exploring humanity, perspective, and proportion. Now scientists turned that same scrutiny to the natural world. Observation, measurement, and mathematics became tools to understand reality, while faith remained a personal and social compass. The two did not always coexist peacefully, but they informed one another, creating a dynamic intellectual environment. This period also saw innovations in instruments and methodology. Quadrants, astrolabes, and compasses allowed navigators and astronomers to chart positions with precision. Dissecting tools, microscopes, and measurement devices enabled physicians to record their findings accurately. The Renaissance emphasis on empirical observation, seeing and recording the world as it truly was, transformed human understanding across disciplines. Science, in this sense, was not merely about cataloguing facts, it was about questioning assumptions. Copernicus asked whether Earth was truly at the center. Vesalius asked whether the accepted anatomy matched reality. Galileo asked whether observation could challenge received wisdom. Each inquiry was an act of courage, because challenging tradition carried risk. Yet the rewards were immense, a clearer understanding of the cosmos, of life, and of human potential. In the process, Renaissance thinkers began to envision a universe that was measurable, ordered, and accessible to reason. They combined mathematics with observation, art with science, and curiosity with method. Their discoveries suggested that nature was intelligible, not mysterious, and that human beings could explore it without fear. The Renaissance, long associated with painting, sculpture, and philosophy, had become a laboratory of knowledge, a place where the cosmos and the body could be examined, understood, and admired. Even as these scientific advances unfolded, they remained intertwined with the broader culture. Artists studied anatomy to render the human form with accuracy. Architects applied geometric principles to design domes and palaces. Scholars debated the implications of heliocentrism, while printing presses circulated texts widely. Knowledge flowed across disciplines, connecting art, science, and philosophy in a web of inquiry that defined the Renaissance. By the early 17th century, the seeds planted by Copernicus, Vesalius, and Galileo had begun to grow into what would later be called modern science. Observation and experimentation, combined with curiosity and courage, reshaped human understanding. Faith and reason, though sometimes in tension, created a dialogue in which questions could be asked and answers tested. The universe was no longer a static, unquestionable cosmos. It was a place to explore, measure, and marvel. As we imagine the scholars of this era leaning over celestial charts, performing careful dissections, peering through telescopes, we see the Renaissance spirit in motion, restless, precise, and endlessly curious. These men and women transformed how humans understood their place in the world, both within the body and across the heavens. Their discoveries remind us that knowledge is not inherited passively, but cultivated actively through observation, calculation, and reflection. Tonight, as you drift into sleep, picture the slow turning of planets, the pulse of veins and the gleam of sunlight on a distant moon. Think of Copernicus calculating orbits, Vesalius holding a scalpel in quiet concentration, Galileo adjusting a lens while stars wheeled overhead. The Renaissance was not only a flowering of art and thought, it was an awakening to the world itself, a recognition that human beings could, through careful observation and unending curiosity, grasp a little more of the grand design that surrounds us. The Renaissance was not confined to cities, workshops, or the printed page. Its restless curiosity reached beyond walls and borders, stirring voyages into oceans unknown. By the late 15th century, European navigators, inspired by ambition, science, and the hunger for trade, set sail into the vast expanse of the Atlantic and beyond. Maps that had once been sketches of imagined lands were slowly replaced by charts filled with coastlines, islands, and continents. The world, in a way, was waking from a long slumber, and humanity was discovering that it was not alone in shaping its fate. The first to capture the imagination of Europe was Christopher Columbus, who in 1492 crossed the Atlantic seeking a westward route to Asia. Backed by the Spanish crown, he believed that by sailing into the unknown, he could find lands rich in spices and silk. Instead, he encountered islands in the Caribbean, home to peoples and ecosystems previously unknown to Europeans. Columbus returned to Spain with tales of lush landscapes, strange flora and fauna, and human societies that challenged European assumptions. The excitement was palpable. For a Europe steeped in the revival of knowledge, here was evidence that the world extended far beyond classical geography. Columbus's voyages sparked a wave of exploration. Amerigo Vespucci, an Italian navigator, journeyed along the coast of South America and began to understand that these lands were not the outskirts of Asia, as Columbus had thought, but a new world entirely distinct. The continents themselves would eventually bear his name, a lasting testament to his observations and letters. His reports described vast rivers, forests that seemed endless, and cultures that Europeans had never imagined. These descriptions fed both curiosity and commerce, as merchants, rulers, and scholars eagerly absorbed the news of distant lands. Meanwhile, the daring circumnavigation led by Ferdinand Magellan in the early 1500s demonstrated that the globe was connected in ways previously unrecognized. Though Magellan himself would die in the Philippines, his expedition proved that the oceans could be crossed continuously, linking east and west. European understanding of the planet shifted. The world was no longer flat, nor were the distant continents mere myths. Geography itself became a science, informed by observation, calculation, and sometimes sheer luck. The Renaissance spirit fueled these voyages. Advances in navigation inspired by mathematical studies and astronomical observation allowed sailors to venture farther than ever. Instruments such as the astrolabe, quadrant, and compass, tools refined in Renaissance workshops, made accurate charting possible. Cartographers could sketch coastlines with precision, and the printing press enabled these maps to circulate widely, providing knowledge that other explorers could build upon. Curiosity, ambition, and technical skill converged to transform the oceans from unknown voids into routes of exchange, discovery, and inevitably, conflict. Yet alongside wonder came consequences that were often overlooked at the time. The encounters between Europeans and indigenous peoples were rarely neutral. Diseases carried inadvertently by ships and crews devastated populations. Conquest and colonization followed exploration, fueled by a desire for wealth, territory, and religious conversion. While explorers marveled at the beauty of new lands, they also imposed structures of power that reshaped societies, often violently. The age of discovery thus contains both exhilaration and sorrow, a paradox that defines much of human history. New foods, plants, and animals began to circulate between continents. Corn, potatoes, and tomatoes traveled from the Americas to Europe, reshaping diets and economies. Sugar, coffee, and spices moved in the opposite direction, driving trade networks that linked Europe, Africa, and the Americas. These exchanges altered the rhythm of daily life, introduced new tastes, and created economic opportunities and inequalities that would shape the centuries to come. Renaissance cities, already centers of commerce, were transformed by these global connections. Seaports such as Lisbon, Seville, and Antwerp became hubs of trade, where goods from distant continents mingled in markets filled with the scents, colors, and sounds of the wider world. Merchants and scholars alike studied new commodities, recording their properties, uses, and potential value. Knowledge was no longer confined to manuscripts or frescoed walls. It had become worldly, practical, and profitable. The period also gave rise to the development of ethnography, cartography, and natural history. Observers recorded the customs, languages, and beliefs of the peoples they encountered. Artists sketched plants, animals, and landscapes with the precision that had been nurtured by Renaissance attention to detail. The Renaissance ideal of understanding the world through observation extended naturally to lands across the ocean. The intellectual curiosity of the age now embraced the globe itself, even as human ambition and greed complicated those encounters. Renaissance thinking encouraged reflection on these discoveries. Scholars debated moral, philosophical, and religious questions raised by contact with distant peoples. How should Europeans relate to societies they had never known? How did new lands fit within existing theological and cosmological frameworks? These debates shaped not only political decisions, but also the literature, art, and intellectual climate of the era. Maps, logs, and illustrations became both practical tools and symbols of a world in flux. A world larger, stranger, and more interconnected than anyone had imagined. Exploration also inspired a new aesthetic in art and literature. Landscapes filled canvases with unfamiliar trees and rivers. Stories of adventure, peril, and discovery enriched poetry and chronicles. Voyages were not just practical enterprises, but imaginative ones. The unknown seas and peoples provided material for reflection, allegory, and wonder. Artists and writers incorporated exotic motifs, unusual animals and distant horizons into works intended for European audiences, expanding the visual and conceptual vocabulary of the Renaissance. At the same time, these voyages laid the groundwork for global trade systems that would dominate the coming centuries. Ports, shipping routes, and colonial enterprises linked Europe with Africa, Asia, and the Americas. While these networks enriched European economies, they also facilitated exploitation, enslavement, and ecological transformation. The Renaissance fascination with discovery thus carried both promise and peril. Curiosity and knowledge intertwined with conquest and control. The Age of Discovery demonstrates that Renaissance ambition was not limited to art, science, or literature. It encompassed a desire to explore, to map, to understand, and to possess. Human beings extended their reach across oceans, encountering other worlds and other cultures, and in doing so they revealed both the possibilities and the dangers of expanding knowledge and power. By the mid-16th century, Europe's understanding of the globe had been irrevocably altered. The New World, previously hidden, was now charted and documented. Routes to Asia were navigable, and distant continents were linked by currents of trade, migration, and knowledge. Renaissance curiosity had moved from classrooms and workshops to ships and harbors, illustrating that human inquiry knows no bounds, and that the spirit of exploration is as restless as the imagination that inspired it. And so, as you imagine the wooden decks of ships creaking under wind and sail, the waves reflecting the horizon, and the first sight of unfamiliar shores, you can sense the dual nature of this expansion, the awe of discovery and the shadow of consequence. Renaissance ambition stretched outward, reshaping maps, minds, and the very understanding of what the world could be. It was a period of wonder and complexity, and its legacy would shape not only the centuries to follow, but the very ways humans perceived themselves on a global stage. As the Renaissance unfolded, it revealed not only new ways of seeing the world, but also new ways of hearing it. Music and theatre became vital expressions of human creativity, reflecting the era's fascination with harmony, emotion, and the complexity of human experience. Across courts, churches, and public squares, sounds evolved alongside art and science, capturing the rhythm of a society in transition. In Italy, the development of polyphony transformed sacred music. Composers such as Josquin des Prez and Palestrina wove voices together in intricate patterns, creating music that was both technically sophisticated and deeply moving. Where earlier compositions had favored a single melody, supported by simple accompaniment, polyphony layered independent lines, each voice contributing to a harmonious whole. The effect was immersive. Listeners could follow separate threads of melody while sensing the unity of the composition. It was music that mirrored Renaissance ideals, complex, balanced, and ordered, yet full of subtle nuance. Sacred music remained central, of course, but secular forms also flourished. Madrigals, short, poetic songs often set to intimate verses about love, nature, or human experience, became a favorite among both amateurs and professional musicians. In Florence, Venice, and Ferrara, composers experimented with harmony, word painting, and rhythm to convey emotion vividly. A rising note might illustrate a sun climbing above the horizon, a descending line suggests sorrow, and overlapping voices could mimic the chatter of a lively garden. Music was no longer a mere accompaniment to ritual. It became a medium for storytelling, emotion, and reflection. Instrumental innovation paralleled these vocal advances. Lutes, viols, harpsichords, and early organs expanded the palette available to musicians. These instruments allowed composers to explore texture and tone in unprecedented ways. In courtly performances, the combination of voices and instruments created immersive experiences where audiences could feel both intellectual delight and emotional resonance. Even in more modest settings, skilled amateurs could reproduce these sounds, spreading musical sophistication beyond the elite. Theatre, too, experienced a renaissance of its own. In Italy, the commedia dell'arte emerged as a lively, improvisational form of performance. Travelling troupes would stage plays in town squares, combining stock characters, physical comedy, and clever dialogue. The plots were often familiar: lovers pursuing one another, tricksters outwitting their masters, servants manipulating situations to their advantage, but the performers brought each story to life with improvisation and charisma. Masks and exaggerated gestures made characters instantly recognizable, allowing audiences to engage with both humor and social commentary. Commedia dell'arte emphasized both universality and individuality. The stock characters, Pantalone, Harlequin, Colombina, offered archetypes that audiences recognized immediately, but within each performance, actors could infuse their own creativity. The improvisational nature meant that no two performances were identical. This approach reflected the Renaissance fascination with both structure and invention, a balance of tradition and spontaneous creativity. Meanwhile, in Northern Europe, theatre was beginning to develop its own traditions. England, in particular, would soon emerge as a centre of dramatic innovation. Early forms of morality plays, religious cycles, and courtly entertainment set the stage for what would become the Elizabethan theatre. These performances explored human virtues and vices, often dramatizing moral dilemmas and social norms. They combined spectacle with reflection, inviting audiences to contemplate behavior, choice, and consequence. The seeds of Shakespeare's England, in fact, were already being sown during this period. Playwrights experimented with narrative, characterization, and poetic language. Stories drew on classical sources, local history, and folklore, creating a rich tapestry of influence. Audiences were not passive. They laughed, cried, and debated the morals presented on stage. Theatre became both entertainment and education, reflecting a society increasingly confident in its ability to observe, interpret, and critique human behavior. Music and theatre were also interconnected. In courtly entertainments, plays were often accompanied by music, with instruments underscoring action, highlighting emotion, or signaling transitions. Composers and playwrights collaborated, ensuring that the performance was cohesive, immersive, and memorable. This integration of sound, story, and movement reflected the Renaissance ideal of total experience, in which multiple senses worked together to produce understanding and delight. Across Europe, audiences were becoming more sophisticated. Merchants, scholars, artisans, and nobles alike attended performances and concerts. Music notation had improved, allowing compositions to be preserved and shared. Printed play scripts enabled actors to study texts and allowed audiences to read and reflect on performances in advance. The printing press, which had revolutionized knowledge in previous decades, now facilitated the spread of music and theatre, standardizing techniques while still leaving room for improvisation and interpretation. Renaissance music, in particular, shows an attention to both mathematics and emotion. Composers applied ratios, scales, and harmonics to create pleasing structures, yet they also allowed dissonance, surprise, and tension to convey human feeling. The same combination appears in theatre. Structured plots and archetypes coexist with improvisation and spontaneous interaction. Across both mediums, the Renaissance celebrated human skill, creativity, and expression. Instruments continued to evolve with experimentation in tuning, range, and construction. New forms of notation allowed for increasingly complex compositions. Courts maintained orchestras, and professional musicians gained social prestige alongside painters, architects, and scholars. Music became a way to display sophistication, status, and intellect, yet it remained deeply tied to human emotion, capable of moving listeners in subtle and profound ways. The theatre, meanwhile, developed spaces designed for performance. Open-air stages, temporary platforms and eventually purpose-built theatres allowed audiences to experience plays more fully. Lighting, acoustics, and stagecraft began to be considered alongside writing and acting. The Renaissance attention to proportion, perspective, and human observation extended naturally to the design of performance spaces, making the act of watching as refined as the act of performing. Religious music, in parallel, retained its contemplative and spiritual role. Choirs in cathedrals and chapels performed masses, motets, and hymns that intertwined devotion with aesthetic pleasure. Sacred compositions were designed to lift the spirit, to support meditation, and to embody divine harmony. These works remind us that the Renaissance did not abandon faith, but rather explored new ways to experience it through sound. The cumulative effect of music and theatre was profound. Renaissance culture was no longer purely visual or intellectual. It was sensory, emotional, and performative. Citizens, nobles, and scholars alike could participate in the creation and enjoyment of culture, whether through playing an instrument, singing in a choir, performing on stage, or simply listening and observing. The arts became a form of communal engagement, a reflection of society's curiosity, skill, and imagination. By the early 17th century, these developments had laid a foundation that would endure for centuries. Madrigals, polyphonic compositions, commedia dell'arte, and early English drama influenced generations of composers, playwrights, and performers. The Renaissance celebration of human creativity, skill, and observation extended beyond visual arts into sound and story, enriching human experience in profound ways. As we imagine the era, voices intertwining in cathedrals, lutes plucked in intimate chambers, masked actors performing in crowded squares, we glimpse the soul of the Renaissance. It was a period in which humans not only sought to understand the world, but to experience it fully, through sight, sound, and imagination. Music and theatre remind us that the Renaissance was alive, resonant, and enduring, echoing through halls, plazas, and minds, shaping how generations would see, feel, and understand the world. Amid the bustling streets of Florence, the grandeur of Roman palaces, and the quiet rooms of study across Europe, women were quietly shaping the Renaissance, often in ways that history has only partially preserved. While the era is often remembered for male painters, sculptors, and thinkers, women exerted influence as patrons, artists, writers, and thinkers, navigating social constraints with intelligence, creativity, and determination. Their voices were sometimes muted, their achievements overlooked, but their presence was vital to the cultural flowering of the age. One of the most remarkable figures of the Italian Renaissance was Isabella d'Este, Marchesa of Mantua. Born in 1474 into the powerful Este family, she married Francesco Gonzaga and became a central figure in the courts of northern Italy. Isabella was a patron of artists, musicians, and writers, creating one of the most vibrant cultural courts in Europe. Her palace became a hub of intellectual activity, where painters such as Mantegna and Correggio could experiment and refine their work. Isabella's letters reveal a keen mind, negotiating diplomacy, education, and the patronage of the arts with equal skill. Through her influence, she shaped taste, supported innovation, and ensured that the Renaissance reached beyond the major urban centers like Florence and Rome. Patronage was one of the primary ways women could wield influence in a society that often restricted their public roles. Women commissioned art, architecture, and music, guiding creative production according to their vision. Their choices determined not only what was created but how it was experienced, giving them subtle power over the cultural landscape. Isabella d'Este's studiolo, a private study filled with paintings, sculptures, and books, stands as a testament to the way women curated both art and knowledge, blending personal taste with intellectual ambition. Yet women were not only patrons, some became artists themselves, challenging norms and expectations. Sophonisba Anguissola, born in Cremona in 1532, emerged as one of the first women to achieve international recognition as a painter. Trained in a private household under the guidance of supportive family members, she mastered portraiture, capturing the likenesses and personalities of her sitters with sensitivity and skill. Anguissola eventually served at the Spanish court, where her work was admired by Philip II. Her success demonstrates that even in a society that often limited women's professional opportunities, talent could find a path, provided it was nurtured and recognized by influential patrons. Education played a crucial role in enabling women to participate in cultural life. Though formal schooling for women was rare, some noble and affluent families ensured that daughters learned reading, writing, music, and sometimes Latin or Greek. These skills allowed women to engage with literature, philosophy, and art, producing letters, poetry, and treatises that reveal a sophisticated understanding of their world. Their writings often addressed themes of morality, virtue, and social observation, offering perspectives that were rarely recorded in male-dominated histories. Christine de Pizan, writing in early 15th century France, exemplifies the intellectual contributions of women. As a poet, philosopher, and court writer, she produced works defending women's capacities, advocating for education, and challenging societal prejudices. Her book of the City of Ladies imagines an allegorical city constructed to honor women's achievements, documenting the lives of historical and contemporary women who had shaped their societies. Christine's work is remarkable not only for its content, but for the courage it took to assert a female voice in a world that often dismissed women's intellect. Despite these successes, women faced numerous constraints. Social norms dictated behavior, inheritance laws limited financial independence, and educational opportunities were often restricted. Many talented women remained confined to private spheres, their skills and ideas transmitted quietly through letters, household instruction, or patronage. Even those who achieved recognition, like Anguissola, navigated delicate negotiations between social expectations and professional ambition. Their achievements were often exceptional precisely because they overcame systemic obstacles. Marriage could be both opportunity and limitation. Noble women, like Isabella d'Este, could leverage their position to act as patrons and intermediaries. Yet marriage also brought expectations of domestic management and political alliance. Women who married outside the elite often had little chance of pursuing artistic or intellectual pursuits openly. Within households, however, women frequently shaped cultural life in private ways, hosting salons, guiding tutors, mentoring daughters, or preserving manuscripts and art collections. These contributions, though less visible, were critical to sustaining and transmitting Renaissance culture. Artistic training for women was also constrained by social norms. Life drawing from nude models, a foundation of Renaissance artistic education, was largely inaccessible to women. This limitation often guided female artists toward portraiture, miniatures, or religious subjects, fields considered appropriate for women. Even within these constraints, women like Lavinia Fontana in Bologna achieved professional success, demonstrating technical mastery and creative vision while navigating societal expectations. Their work offers a window into the delicate balance between ambition and decorum, skill and propriety that defined women's participation in the Renaissance. Music and performance provided another avenue for women to express creativity. Noble women learned instruments, sang in private chambers, and participated in courtly entertainments. Their performances were often integrated into diplomatic and social life, enhancing cultural exchange and demonstrating refinement. In some cases, women composed songs and madrigals contributing to the musical evolution of the period, even if their names were rarely recorded in official histories. The letters, diaries, and writings of Renaissance women reveal a remarkable consciousness of their position. Many reflected on the tension between aspiration and limitation, ambition and expectation. They negotiated intellectual and artistic spaces with careful attention to reputation, morality, and social alliances. Their lives were acts of negotiation, blending private cultivation with public influence. Through their letters, we glimpse the networks of communication, mentorship, and collaboration that allowed ideas to circulate across gendered boundaries. Religion was both a constraint and a source of opportunity. Women often engaged in spiritual practice, writing devotional texts, founding religious institutions, or supporting the arts within a sacred context. These endeavors provided socially acceptable means of intellectual and creative expression, while allowing women to shape the moral and aesthetic character of their communities. Religious devotion, combined with patronage and education, offered channels through which women could leave lasting marks on the Renaissance landscape. Ultimately, the Renaissance demonstrates that women were not absent from cultural and intellectual life. They were active participants, shaping taste, creating art, and contributing to knowledge, even if historical records often muted their presence. Figures like Isabella d'Este, Sophonisba Anguissola, and Christine de Pizan remind us that influence can be subtle, that creativity can flourish within constraint, and that human curiosity is not limited by gender. Their lives invite reflection on the interplay of opportunity, talent, and social context, and on the many ways women have shaped history even when the spotlight was not theirs to claim. As we consider these lives, women commissioning artworks, painting portraits, writing treatises, performing music, and navigating courts, we recognize that the Renaissance was not only the work of men, but a shared cultural awakening. The voices and silences of women echo through letters, canvases, and patronage, revealing an era of human creativity that was broader, deeper, and more nuanced than traditional narratives might suggest. And so, as we linger on the stories of Renaissance women, we can imagine Isabella's studiolo filled with treasured works, Anguissola's careful brush capturing subtle expression, and Christine de Pizan's allegorical city rising in the imagination. Their contributions, sometimes quiet, sometimes celebrated, are threads in the rich tapestry of an age defined by curiosity, ambition, and the enduring desire to leave a mark on the world. As the 16th century progressed, the Renaissance, which had flourished in cities, courts, and workshops across Europe, began to encounter turbulence. The intellectual curiosity, artistic brilliance, and humanist optimism that had defined the era now faced forces that would shake the continent. Political strife, religious upheaval, and military conflicts disrupted the delicate balance that had nurtured creativity. Yet even in decline, the Renaissance left enduring marks on culture, thought, and human imagination. One of the earliest and most profound shocks came from within the Church itself. By the early 1500s, calls for reform were growing louder. Critics challenged practices such as the sale of indulgences, corruption among clergy, and the accumulation of wealth within ecclesiastical hierarchies. Martin Luther, a German monk and scholar, emerged as a central figure in what would become the Protestant Reformation. His 95 Theses, nailed to a church door in Wittenberg in 1517, questioned the Church's authority and sparked debates that spread rapidly through print, pamphlets, and word of mouth. The Reformation was not simply a theological argument, it was a profound cultural shift. It fractured Christendom, creating new religious denominations and challenging centuries of tradition. In regions such as Germany, Scandinavia, and England, reformers demanded that scripture, worship, and religious life be accessible to ordinary people. The Renaissance emphasis on literacy, humanism, and study of classical texts intersected with these demands, as reading and interpretation became tools of both spiritual and intellectual inquiry. Italy, the heart of the Renaissance, was not immune to upheaval. The sack of Rome in 1527 by troops of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V left the city in ruins, shaking the authority of the papacy and halting cultural patronage for a time. Artists, scholars, and citizens alike witnessed destruction on a scale previously unimaginable. Libraries looted, treasures carried away, and the streets filled with chaos. The event marked a turning point, signaling that the age of relative stability and flourishing might be yielding to a more tumultuous era. Political power across Europe was shifting as well. City-states that had once enjoyed autonomy, such as Florence and Venice, now faced external pressures from emerging nation-states and imperial ambitions. The delicate balance of patronage that had supported artists, architects, and thinkers was disrupted by war, taxation, and changing alliances. Commissions became less predictable, and some artists, like Michelangelo in his later years, moved between cities and patrons, adapting to an increasingly uncertain environment. Cultural transformations followed these crises. The clarity, harmony, and proportion of the High Renaissance gave way to a style historians call mannerism. Artists such as Pontormo, Parmigianino, and Bronzino experimented with elongated forms, unusual perspectives, and dramatic tension. Where earlier Renaissance works sought balance and idealized perfection, mannerism introduced distortion, ambiguity, and emotional intensity. The style reflected a world in flux, confident yet uneasy, beautiful yet unsettling. Art, like politics and religion, was adapting to a new reality. Science and discovery, too, faced challenges. While figures like Galileo and Vesalius continued to advance knowledge, their work often clashed with authority, and the tension between faith and reason became more pronounced. The intellectual freedom that had fostered inquiry in earlier decades now existed alongside censorship, persecution, and the threat of exile. Scholars learned to navigate not only the complexities of nature, but also the dangers of speaking boldly in a world of competing ideologies. Yet even in this turbulent era, the Renaissance spirit endured. Artists continued to innovate, scientists continued to observe, and writers continued to reflect on human experience. The tools, techniques, and ideas developed during the preceding centuries provided a foundation that could survive upheaval. Perspective in painting, anatomical accuracy, literary humanism, and scientific method, all innovations of the Renaissance, continued to inform creative and intellectual work, even as patronage shifted and political crises intensified. Education remained a crucial arena for Renaissance thought. Universities and private tutors continued to teach classical texts, mathematics, and philosophy, even as religious and political divisions spread. Humanist ideals of critical thinking, moral reflection, and the study of humanity itself persisted, influencing new generations. Letters, treatises, and printed books allowed ideas to circulate across boundaries, preserving knowledge even in times of disruption. The Reformation also inspired reflection on the nature of authority and personal responsibility. As individuals were encouraged to read Scripture and interpret it for themselves, questions about governance, ethics, and civic life grew more prominent. The Renaissance had cultivated curiosity and observation. The crises of the era demanded that these faculties be applied not only to art and science, but also to faith, politics, and society. The result was a more complex, multifaceted culture, one aware of both possibility and peril. In addition to religious and political turmoil, economic shifts influenced cultural production. Trade routes changed, silver and gold from the Americas flowed unevenly through Europe, and some urban centers faced decline. Patrons who had once funded grand projects found their resources redirected to defense, diplomacy, or survival. Yet economic pressure also fostered adaptation. Artists and scholars learned to work with smaller commissions, to innovate with limited materials, and to explore markets beyond their home cities. The Renaissance ethos of ingenuity persisted even under constraint. Across Europe, cities and courts became laboratories of adaptation. Rome rebuilt after the sack. Florence adjusted under Medici leadership. Venice continued to thrive as a mercantile hub. Artists such as Titian in Venice and El Greco in Spain absorbed Renaissance principles while creating work responsive to contemporary tastes and conditions. Their innovations demonstrate that the Renaissance was not a static moment, but a dynamic, evolving culture, capable of transformation even as its initial brilliance faced challenges. The waning of the Renaissance also reminds us that human creativity is rarely linear. Peaks of achievement coexist with periods of crisis and uncertainty. Political instability, war, and religious conflict may disrupt patronage and production, but they also inspire new approaches, experiments, and reflections. The turbulence of the 16th century ultimately prepared the ground for future developments in art, science, philosophy, and governance. The Renaissance left behind techniques, knowledge, and ideals that would endure, even as its immediate context shifted. In the end, the story of decline is intertwined with the story of legacy. Even as cities burned, armies marched, and religious conflicts divided communities, the achievements of the Renaissance remained visible. The domes, frescoes, and sculptures, the humanist texts and scientific treatises, the music, poetry, and theatrical works. These cultural artifacts continue to teach, inspire, and inform, bridging the gap between the Golden Age and the centuries that followed. As we imagine the period, the chaos of Rome's streets, the shifting alliances in Florence, the experimentation of artists adjusting to new tastes, we see that the Renaissance was resilient. Its principles of observation, curiosity, and the pursuit of human excellence persisted, even in the face of adversity. The era may have lost some of its original clarity and stability, but its spirit remained alive in every work of art, every scientific observation, and every humanist text that survived. Tonight, as you picture the flickering candles of a Renaissance study, the hurried hand of a scholar copying notes, or the strain of a painter adjusting a composition under new political pressures, you can sense the mixture of brilliance and fragility that characterized this time. The Renaissance, even in its waning, reminds us that human creativity thrives not only in moments of stability, but also amid uncertainty, turbulence, and transformation. Its light may have dimmed, but it continues to illuminate the paths of knowledge, art, and thought for generations to come. As the 16th century faded into the 17th, the Renaissance left behind a Europe transformed. Cities, courts, and academies had become repositories of knowledge, art, and innovation. The achievements of painters, sculptors, scholars, and explorers were no longer confined to their moment. They reverberated across time, shaping thought, culture, and society for centuries to come. The Renaissance was not an isolated burst of brilliance. It was a foundation, a spark that would ignite the ideals of the Enlightenment and continue to influence modernity in subtle and profound ways. One of the most visible legacies lies in art. The techniques developed by Renaissance painters, perspective, chiaroscuro, anatomical accuracy, and the careful observation of nature remained influential long after the High Renaissance had passed. Artists in the Baroque, Neoclassical, and Romantic periods built upon these foundations, experimenting with composition, light, and form while pushing boundaries in their own ways. The meticulous study of human anatomy, pioneered by figures like Leonardo da Vinci and Vesalius, allowed artists to portray bodies with realism that continues to inspire. Sculpture, too, benefited from Renaissance innovations, with the expressive tension of Michelangelo's works informing later generations of sculptors who sought to capture both motion and emotion in marble and bronze. Architecture carries a similar story. The revival of classical forms, columns, arches, domes, and proportional systems created a vocabulary that endured for centuries. Renaissance architects, influenced by Vitruvius and their own observations, combined mathematical precision with aesthetic harmony. Cities across Europe adopted these principles, blending local traditions with classical inspiration. The domes of Florence and Rome, the orderly facades of palaces, and the careful layout of squares and streets became templates for urban design, demonstrating that the Renaissance was as much a matter of built environment as of art or philosophy. The impact of Renaissance thought on science and philosophy is equally enduring. By encouraging observation, experimentation, and critical inquiry, Renaissance scholars helped lay the groundwork for the scientific revolution. The heliocentric model proposed by Copernicus, the anatomical studies of Vesalius, and the telescopic discoveries of Galileo were not isolated achievements. They reflected a broader intellectual culture that valued curiosity, evidence, and the questioning of authority. These principles carried into the Enlightenment, where reason and empirical investigation became central to human understanding. The Renaissance mindset, restless, analytical, and imaginative, continues to shape modern scientific inquiry. Political thought, too, bears the imprint of the Renaissance. Humanist writings explored the nature of leadership, ethics, and civic responsibility. Thinkers such as Machiavelli, whose The Prince offered pragmatic advice to rulers, engaged directly with the realities of power, while also raising questions about morality, governance, and the role of human agency. The study of classical history, rhetoric, and philosophy provided frameworks for understanding political organization and human behavior. These ideas would later influence constitutional thought, political theory, and debates about governance across Europe and beyond. Renaissance humanism, with its focus on the study of humanity, ethics, and the classics, shaped the way individuals approached education, literature, and intellectual life. Scholars and writers encouraged critical thinking, careful study, and the cultivation of virtue. Universities incorporated humanist curricula, emphasizing languages, literature, and moral philosophy alongside traditional subjects. This emphasis on broad education and reasoned thought laid the foundation for modern liberal arts education and continues to inform pedagogical principles today. Exploration and global encounters, which had expanded horizons during the Age of Discovery, also left enduring marks. The Renaissance curiosity that propelled voyages across oceans facilitated cultural exchange, trade, and the spread of knowledge. While colonization brought suffering and displacement, it also connected continents, fostering new crops, materials, and ideas that transformed economies, diets, and societies. Maps, navigational instruments, and travelogues produced during this period informed both commerce and intellectual inquiry, shaping a more interconnected understanding of the world. Renaissance music and theatre contributed to cultural evolution as well. Polyphony, instrumental experimentation, and theatrical innovation created forms that continued to develop through the Baroque and Classical periods. The emphasis on harmony, emotion, and dramatic narrative in music and performance influenced composition, opera, and literature for generations. The Commedia dell'arte, with its stock characters and improvisation, provided structural and stylistic foundations that echo in modern theatre and performance art. Music, like visual art, became a vehicle for expressing human experience, bridging intellect, emotion, and imagination. Perhaps one of the most subtle yet profound legacies of the Renaissance is the humanist ideal itself, the notion that individuals can observe, understand, and shape their world. Renaissance thinkers encouraged self-reflection, curiosity, and engagement with both nature and culture. This ethos fostered innovation in science, art, literature, and governance. It emphasized human potential, not as abstract theory, but as lived practice, embedded in daily observation, study, and creation. Even today, the values of inquiry, creativity, and critical thinking trace their roots to this intellectual awakening. The Renaissance also reminds us of the interplay between continuity and change. While it drew inspiration from classical antiquity, it reinterpreted those ideas in light of contemporary realities. Artists, scientists, and thinkers combined tradition with experimentation, reverence with innovation. This balance allowed the Renaissance to resonate beyond its own time, creating tools, methods, and frameworks that subsequent generations could adopt, adapt, or challenge. It is a reminder that cultural flourishing depends not solely on invention, but on engagement with the past and attentive observation of the present. Even in our modern world, the Renaissance continues to be a mirror for reflection. Museums preserve its art, libraries house its texts, and universities study its principles. The methods of inquiry, the emphasis on empirical observation, the celebration of human creativity, and the recognition of interconnected disciplines are all part of a legacy that quietly underpins contemporary thought. We walk streets, view paintings, read books, and navigate cities shaped by ideas first nurtured during this rebirth of learning and culture. As we imagine wandering through the ruins, libraries, and cities of the Renaissance, there is a sense of continuity. The shadows of past thinkers, artists, and explorers still linger. The domes and frescoes, the carefully measured proportions, the careful study of human anatomy, the maps of distant lands, they are reminders that human curiosity, ambition, and creativity are enduring forces. Even as centuries pass, their glow persists, touching modern eyes, ears, and minds. The Renaissance teaches patience and attentiveness. It shows that progress is often gradual, built on observation, reflection, and sustained effort. Artists refined technique over decades, scholars recorded and debated ideas, explorers charted new lands step by step. The achievements of the era are not merely monuments to individual genius, but testimonies to persistent engagement, collaboration, and the quiet accumulation of knowledge. Tonight, as you drift into sleep, imagine walking through a sunlit gallery, the colors of Titian or Raphael warming the walls. Hear the echoes of madrigals sung in intimate chambers. Imagine the turn of a page in a carefully preserved manuscript, or the soft creak of a ship crossing an unknown sea. The Renaissance is all around, a whispering presence in art, science, philosophy, and the very ways we understand and inhabit the world. Its light may have waned in the face of history's turbulence, but its essence continues to illuminate human thought and imagination. In the quiet of this reflection, it becomes clear that the Renaissance was more than a historical period. It was a testament to what curiosity, courage, and creativity can achieve. It reminds us that human beings, when encouraged to observe, question, and create, can leave marks that endure far beyond their lifetimes. And though centuries have passed, we remain connected to that time, wandering through its legacies, touched by its glow, and inspired by its persistent call to explore, understand, and imagine. The Renaissance, in its art, thought, and spirit, lives on, not as a distant memory, but as a continuing invitation to see clearly, think deeply, and create boldly. Its echoes remind us that every brushstroke, discovery, and reflection has the potential to resonate across generations, shaping not only the culture of its own time, but the world we inhabit today. In its quiet, persistent way, the Renaissance whispers to us still, inviting us to observe, wonder, and participate in the ongoing story of human endeavor.